I'm your host, Davida Shinsky, and you're listening to Live Without Limits. Dreams can come true if you have the right mindset. And today we're going to talk about how childhood trauma affects you as an adult and how to seek help for many reasons. What the experiences we have as young children affect us as adults. And when we get into a similar experience, we will react the same way. For instance, if you're caught in a rainstorm outside and you see lightning strike a tree, what happens? The next time you're caught in a thunderstorm and you see lightning, you don't even have to see it hit the tree, but you will automatically show fear because of that past experience. If you suffered childhood trauma, can it cause problems when you're an adult? If you don't heal the wounds associated with the trauma, can it impact your adult relationships? Experts agree that unhealed childhood trauma can impact adult relationships. The pain associated with the trauma one can bring right into their relationships. Children are indeed resilient, but what they go through during childhood certainly affects them later in life. If trauma is involved, it is likely to show up right smack in the middle of an intimate relationship. Before I go into it, I want to give you a little backstory about why this is so important to me. That I grew up with a disability at a time when society did not accept its disability community. And the family that I grew up in was very, very dysfunctional. I had a father that physically abused and a mother that was verbally and emotionally abused. All she ever could do was tell you what you couldn't do. And because I grew up where I was being physically abused, that for many reasons that when I started studying psychology, I understood that for me, what I was doing was I was protecting myself from that abuse. And it was very hard for me to let my guard down to create a relationship with someone. And in a way, I would love to have had a relationship with someone, but at the same time, also the when you talk about nature and nurture, that in society at that time, people with disabilities were kind of hidden away and not even acknowledged that they existed. And when I was in school, because I was the only person with a disability, I was isolated because people either teased me or they laughed at me, but they were unwilling to get to know who I was. And then at the same time, because the disability that I have affects how I learn, and that what I take into short term memory does not always go into long term memory. Therefore, when I took the test, I didn't always show what I was truly capable of. And so then I got labeled. Well, all of those things have affected who I am as an adult. And it's also why when I got into college, and it was only after I graduated from my undergraduate degree and went into graduate school that the laws began to change and the Individual Disability Education Act came in 1977 and took effect in 1980. And for the first time, people with disabilities were guaranteed the right to an education. And because of that, because children sat next to someone with a disability, they were learning to understand disabilities. And 25 years later, I remember actually running into someone that I knew from high school and earlier that actually apologized to me for how he treated me back then. So they were only a product of their environment. And at the same time, knowing that I came from an environment where I had a father that was physically abusive, I could have very easily ended up in a similar situation. And I knew that was not the kind of relationship that I wanted. And I really put a wall between me to protect myself from that abuse. And yet I I met people in recently in the last 10 years who literally got married, one because she was afraid no one else would ask her, and the other one because he was the only one that even wanted her. And you know what? Both of them ended up being physically abused by their spouses and stayed in those relationships long term. So when we don't realize just how much that what happens to us early on in childhood affects who we are as an adult. So, what is childhood trauma? Childhood trauma is something that causes a child's life that is traumatic, such as abuse, neglect, illness, and anything else. There are plenty of things that happen to children, but not all of it is considered traumatic. And not all of it will come back to haunt you later in life. It's worth noting that trauma is not defined in the same way for every child, as one child may experience something and find it traumatizing while another child will not. It is subjective experience. All of that is based on your personality and how you see things. Because someone who's a dominant personality and believes they can control their environment and everything in it, they're going to experience something very different than someone who's very reserved and laid back, or someone who has a conscientiousness behavior pattern or a steadiness behavior pattern. Because the steadiness behavior pattern is someone that literally, when they work for a company, they will read the rules and they will follow the rules right down to the T. And the conscientiousness behavior pattern questions everything before they make a decision. There are internal traumas that occur, like physical or sexual abuse, and unintentional traumas, like the death of a loved one, an accident, or a natural disaster. The first 6 or 7 years of life are quite impressionable for a child, as it is during these years a child forms their identity. If they are experiencing traumatic events, they are not emotionally equipped to know how to cope with those traumas. Therefore, it doesn't get processed or healed. Their cognitive abilities and their central nervous system just aren't fully developed at this time. And, for example, let's say that Johnny was neglected as a child. His parents didn't teach him to communicate well, so he stuffed down a lot of thoughts and emotions. As an adult, he discovers that he cannot communicate or connect well with other adults. Amanda, who was sexually abused as a child, fears commitment in relationships. Other types of childhood trauma include loss of a loved one, sexual abuse, physical abuse, lack of attention, neglect, illness or surgery, bullying, an accident, natural disasters, family member substance abuse, family member having mental illness. Now, I just listed a bunch of stuff, and how many times have you heard in the news where people have committed crimes and they talked about what happened to them with children and how it affected them? Or you've listened to a celebrity or a politician where they've talked about their childhood and the kind of homes they came from and how it affected them. Because many a times, if someone has an addictive behavior themselves, it's usually because someone else in the family had an addictive behavior. Children, if they come from abusive homes, they learn to abuse other people. How childhood trauma affects your adult life. If you're carrying around childhood trauma, you've got some deep emotional wounds that you may or may not consciously feel, but desire to be healed. They sit underneath the surface, dormant, but the built up energy wants to explode so that it can be resolved and integrated back into your psyche. Let's look at some signs that you have some buried childhood trauma, anxiety, irritability and anger, chronic depression, mood swings, chronic fatigue, a sense of fear or danger much of the time, experiencing long periods of grief, frightening memories of nightmares, codependency or inability to form healthy relationships, alcohol and or drug abuse. You feel emotionally numb. You may feel the symptoms all the time or periodically, and something might trigger such feelings like an anniversary of an event or a new relationship or a dream. Also, some other things that can affect it is if you kind of see someone or hear someone and they're talked about and their behavior sounds so similar to someone that abused you, then what happens? That that anger and that hostility gets reacted from somewhere within you and directed towards that person who you have no relationship with or who you just happen to hear about in passing. So there's many ways that the traumas come out if you understand why and can go back and learn where it all comes from because the only way to get over those traumas is to face them and to deal with them. It may okay, what you can do if you feel you have experienced childhood trauma is you if you feel as if you've experienced childhood trauma and it is affecting your life now, there are some things that you can do to foster healing and growth. Before we get into that, I want you to know that it is not your fault at all that you experienced trauma. So do not blame yourself. What happened was out of your control and it is unfortunate. However, now that you're conscious of the effects of the trauma, you can move forward knowing that you can get free from underneath the pain associated with it. And how do you do that? Well, the first way to do that is to get some help and find out how you can actually overcome those things. Because if you learn where they come from, there's modalities like transactional analysis or or psychodrama or intensive therapy. And what they do is, especially in psychodrama, is it gives you an opportunity to act out what happened to you as a child and and create a scene where you've got someone that's your mirror self that's going to say things that will help you to verbalize what you don't know or can't say. And also, it's an opportunity for you to work through those childhood traumas so you can develop healthy relationships. Reach out for help. If you're dealing with negative emotions due to childhood trauma, the best thing that you can do is to reach out for help in processing and getting through these these emotions. Oftentimes, children who encounter traumatic situations just don't know what to do with their emotions. So they stuff them inside and detach from them. They simply don't have the coping skills at such a young age to process them. These emotions don't just disappear, you carry them throughout your life. And at the same point, they want to be dealt with. They are asking you to cope with them so they can dissipate and you can feel some peace. Therefore, a professional counselor or trauma therapist is key to contending with childhood trauma. A trained professional can help you go back and discover just what occurred, how you contended with the trauma, and how it is affecting you today. Once you can establish the relationship between the past and the present, there are techniques for processing and letting such emotions go so that you can move on with your life peaceful and happy and have healthy relationships. Because one thing that happens is when you grow up in an environment where it's an unhealthy relationship, then what happens? That's the kind of relationship you end up having with someone else as an adult and affecting your children in the same way that you were affected because that's all you know. So, it is important to note that you should be careful in, in contacting and blaming your family or others that were involved with your childhood trauma. If you're angry or sad, process these feelings with a counselor first instead of approaching your family. This will be more effective to your inner healing than lashing out at your family members. Healing begins when you realize that the root of your current emotional issues. In order to begin your healing journey, make a commitment to reach out for help today. You may feel a bit scared to work through the trauma, but rest assured that in the end result will help you feel much higher and happier. Reach out for help today. Also, here's something else to think about that even in my case, I've actually had the help through the training that I got as a psychotherapist and many psychotherapists who deal or work with adults who suffered childhood trauma themselves have suffered childhood trauma. Now, in this case, what I'm doing is I have a program that's called Change Your Thoughts, Transform Your Life. That what it's to do is to help you understand why you react the way you do and how to change those negative feelings to one of being positive. So the first day we talk about the unconscious thoughts and how it affects how you communicate. The second day we talk about toxic relationships, which is what we've been talking about in this presentation today, and how it affects your mental health. The third day we're going to talk about the workplace culture and the elements, and that's how you communicate and understanding what's your natural behavioral style and how you can adapt that to the people you're talking to. The next day, we're going to be talking about how to change your negative thoughts into positive ones. And then the last day, we will talk about where do you go from here. Now, if you're interested in taking this program, go to changeyourthoughtschallenge.com/join the challenge. And I look forward to seeing you there.